One of the most amazing Canadian publishing success stories of the last year or so is the book called The Trouble with Canda. It was published in February of 1990. It rose quickly to the bestseller list. It stayed high on them for 27 weeks. It's already in its fifth printing. It's sold more than 15,000 copies. It's made its author one of the most popular guests in the country on phone-in shows, which of course sells him still more books. The author is William D. Gairdner, and he joins me now. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Before we get to the book, and I don't want to wrestle with lots of stuff that's in the book, can I find out a bit about you? You're a businessman, an academic, you're a PhD,
Yes.
and you're an Olympic decathlete in the 60s,
Right.
64?
Yeah, 64. I won't say it must have been your generation, too. That would be too bold of me.
No, I was sitting watching in 64. Were you good at the decathlon?
Not very, no. The decathlon, really, in my day, was designed for those who were jacks of all trades and master of none, And I sort of was that way. And my coach was Lloyd Percival. You may remember Lloyd.
Yeah.
He was Canada's fitness guru. And
Lloyd Percival beat us at hockey by teaching the Russians how to play. They took all his ideas.
Yes, they did. So,
And this isn't your first book either, is it?
well, I wrote a book which was really designed for the academic market about 8 years ago called The Critical Wager. And it was a study of what I called the architecture of ideology. Fancy phrase to mean I was very interested in the way in which people get fond of ideologies, and then they kind of get trapped inside the structure of them. And often when they run against counter evidence, that the ideology doesn't answer, they start skewing the ideology and twisting it. And it really interested me to see that happen. My theory being that eventually the skewing gets so bad that the whole structure has to collapse, which is what we saw happen in Eastern Europe with Eastern European socialism a year ago.
Now, where did the Trouble with Canda start then? Did it grow out of that idea and something that would apply to this country? Because, I've talked about the book as a bestseller, which it is, but I don't think you sat down to write a bestseller.
No, I sat down really to write a book which, let me back up. The other book kind of got me into economics a little bit. I'm not an economist, and I'm not a politician. But I got very interested in, as I say, the ideologies behind these systems. And economics really is ideologically driven in much of the world, specifically in socialist and communist countries. It's ideologically driven here, too. And so that got me interested in reading books like that. So I started off reading a lot of, the standard great books in these areas by Hayek and von Mises. And then I got into Gilder and Charles Murray and sociology of it and so on. And just got passionately involved in the subject area. And then I began to see Canada quite differently as a country which, in my view, was heading in the wrong direction and had been for some time, specifically the last 20 or 30 years. I thought, gee, someone's got to ring the alarms and say something about this because, I walk up my door, the sun is shining, it's beautiful out there, but what's really happening? And, I have 5 kids, so I worry about what's going to happen to them and to this country after I'm gone. So somehow I got pregnant with the book.
I talked about it as a bestseller, and it's hard not to notice the phenomenon of its success. But it isn't all hype. It isn't the phone-in shows. You've struck a chord with some of the things that you're saying, and we'll never cover all the subjects in the book or all the aspects of it. What's the chord? What is it that you're saying that people are responding to?
Well, I think what they're responding to, and some of them don't like it, but they still are honest enough to say, gee, this has got me thinking, which I appreciate. I didn't try to please anybody in the book. I just wanted to speak out, which is why the subtitle is A Citizen Speaks Out. When people ask me what is the trouble with Canada, I say that the trouble with Canada is that we have gone through a great transformation. We've been transformed from a classical liberal society to a social welfare state in a mere period of 20 or 30 years. Now, I know all the roots for that were laid a long time ago. And what I'm talking about in my book really has happened to a great degree to the U.S., and it's happened to many Western democracies at the same time, so Canada's not alone. But what really began to upset me as I wrote the book was that this transformation wasn't just political in nature, it was also a moral transformation. I saw Canada used to be a country that was built upon the idea of what I call moral agency. I mean by that the idea then was that each individual should express his or her freedoms within the context of a society in which there were rules, which were the same for everyone. And the role of government in that society was to referee, not to play the game, and certainly not to modify the behavior of the people through social policy. That was sort of a no-no in the classical liberal state. But most important of all, I think, for individuals and for families, excuse me, the idea was that each individual would act like a moral agent, someone who would add to or subtract from the moral fiber of his or her society, and could get to the good life on his own or her own. That was the fundamental motivating ideal of Canada when it began, and of the U.S. and of many Western democracies. Over that time, it's happened so fast, people are just waking up to it now. We have changed radically into a society which has a radically different assumption. The assumption now is rather the opposite. Not that we can lead ourselves to the light as individuals, but that we have to be led by elites, by bureaucrats, by politicians, by therapists, by social scientists, by policymakers, fundamentally by people who know better than we do what's good for us. And if we don't want to follow them, then we're probably going to get pushed.
What if a person were to suggest to you that what you're saying is the trouble with Canada is that it's Canada? I mean, I might want to quarrel with you about our whole tradition as what you call a liberal democracy, because everyone who wants to use that phrase got its own definition of liberal.
Right, that's right.
But what if I were to say to you that one of the defining characteristics of this country, as it has evolved and always has been, is what, for want of a better word, is huddling together against the cold? I mean, in a sparsely populated land, we learned how to do things together. We made public institutions where private institutions wouldn't work. We made a public pot to finance the arts, because we didn't have fortunes, private fortunes to do that. We made a public railway. We made a public airline. We made a public broadcasting system. We made other things. And out of the same kind of idea, the prairie populism and the true social democracy, we made a social network, beginning with Jack Pickersgill and Paul Martin and other people, led by Tommy. But and also out of the tradition of our francophones and this is who we are. So what you're attacking is not where we've gone, but who we are.
Well, that's why an MP in Quebec referred to my book in a positive way as an absolute bloody scandal. He said, because you're making us all think about this and think about it very hard. Let me address what you just said. I consider that to be the kind or humane view of Canada. And Canadians, by the way...
Well, I feel kindly and humanely about this country.
Well, I do too. That's why I wrote the book. Now, I say to people when I talk to them that you can't write a book like this unless you love your country. It's like you can't discipline your kids unless you love them. If you don't care about them, you don't write books and you don't discipline them. You leave them alone and you turn your back. In fact, you probably leave or they leave. So I love my country. That's why I wrote the book. And on the business of being humane, I say through and through the book that I think any decent society has to look after the truly needy. But there's a huge difference between a hand up and a hand out. This country's gone from a hand-up philosophy.
You say that, but even your staunchest fans, I think, Western Report, who think you've written the greatest book since Who Was Seen to Win, even they say you don't explain the difference between a hand up and a hand out.
I read that critique too, and it wasn't bad, but it would take another chapter to riposte, to respond. And I would say, let's look at what's happened to the country. Everything you say about country was true 30, 40 years ago. But 30 or 40 years ago...
But wait a minute. You just said we've changed to what we've become.
No, I said everything you say was true. The sentiments were true. Yeah. Yet 30 or 40 years ago, Canadians spent 25% of GNP on governments at all three levels in this country, okay? They got a certain standard of education, of roads, or of social services, or whatever. Arguably, things were a lot better then in many people's minds. Here we are today, okay? Canadians are spending on average 52% of income on of GNP on governments at all three levels. We have a $600 billion debt, which works out to $85,000 for every family of four in this country. Someone's got to stop it. Tax Freedom Day was March 31st, 35 years ago. Today it's July 7th. When my youngest boy...
Tax Freedom Day is the day we get past...
Free of government, When my youngest boy...
We earn $1 for ourselves.
Yeah, when he's old enough to earn his first paycheck, I mean, Tax Freedom Day could be October 1st. Listen, food, clothing, and housing and taxes were more or less the same level 35 years ago. Since that time, the Consumer Price Index has gone up 400%. Taxes have gone up 1,400% for the average Canadian family. People are sick to death of it because what they're not seeing is better schools. They are not seeing more charitable feelings amongst the people. What they're seeing is more government. The Swiss, whom I consider to be a very well-governed federation, have one bureaucrat for every 50 citizens. Canada, do you know, has one for every 10? I mean, we are seriously overgoverned. And the view of my book, I'm getting wound up here, is that we are being...
That's why you're here.
We are being cannibalized by paid politicians, and we have no means to stop them. I do suggest some means in my book, by the way, but this cannibalization process, I mean, it's a harsh term, but it is happening. And unlike the Americans and the Australians and the Swiss, we have no instruments or political tools to stop them or slow them down. We don't have recall procedures. We don't have referenda. We have no way, we have no fiscal guillotine to stop the spending. I mean, it's a glutton out there.
How confident are you in the wisdom of the populace, because some of the people who have disagreed with your book, and you've had some ferocious reviews, from many of them from predictable places.
Yeah, that's right.
But would say that at heart you really don't believe in a democratic process. You do keep arguing for a more bottom-up politics. That's that's the Preston Manning Reform Party and many other parties. Bottom up. Sounds really good.
Well, they borrowed the term from me, for that matter.
Well, you didn't invent it. Preston Manning's quoting you?
Put it this way, the term top-down, bottom-up, together in the same chapter, I haven't seen them before. And they caught the public imagination because people sensed the difference, It articulated a popular feeling in that book. That's what happened.
How strongly do you feel about the power of that bottom-up, meaning that it's the power of the people? Because there is, it seems to me, through the analysis of the Trouble with Canda, there is the suggestion that we are very manipulatable. We can be manipulated easily. We're supine. So how can you say that, and at the same time give us back the power, and we'll put the right people in?
Well,
or make the right decisions.
I'm glad you put your finger on that, because it is presently a conflict in my mind too, and I tried to articulate in the book. See, I too feel that Canadians are ideologically unsophisticated and have been somewhat supine and sheepish and all too accepting of people who are basically marauding over them. And so I wrote the book to try to give it some feeling. And what I've been most pleased with across this country is that the most common thing people have said to me is, boy, here's a book which finally put into words all the things I've been thinking and feeling all these years. And that's been a very rewarding response to get from people.
But you also know that if you stand up and say the taxes are too high, there are too many welfare bums, we've got it. I mean, if you do that, you're going to have a lot of people saying, right on, brother.
Yeah, but the book doesn't say that, though. You see, it explains where taxes have come from.
Well,
it asks Canadians to question what they're getting for those taxes, and most of all, it asks them to see the radical transformation in our society which has taken place and which is still taking place.
But let's look at some of the things you are saying, because I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that many of the things you're saying, many of the points you're making, reflect some things that a lot of people are feeling. But it's important for me to know, how far do you, as the guy who's, you say, breaking ground here, want to go with some of these things? I mean, you want to de-universalize most of the social system. Program, the medical system, right?
Sure, I don't need a baby bonus check for my 5 kids. Why should I get it? It's taking money from other people's pockets.
Well, you know the answer to that. The answer to that is because we need a universal program, because we don't want means tests for that sort of thing, and the way we're going to do it is to give you the baby bonus check and then claw it back from you.
And I say the reason we don't want means tests is because we have tried very hard to train the Canadian population that these things are rights, and we've enshrined that idea in our charter. Canada's got one of the only ideological charters in the whole world, specifically ideological. We actually entrench in our charter the idea of paying hundreds upon thousands of Canadians to stay in parts of the country where there are no jobs and where we know there never will be any jobs.
But every time a politician in this country has made any serious effort to do the kind of thing that you suggest is only the beginning, the populist squeals are so loud that that politician is right out of business. I mean, you want to run on a political platform that says it's going to have the end of the social safety network? Would you really think you could do that? Do you think you can dismantle Medicare because as you say, and run on a platform of that?
I do.
When the United States is moving toward a system of public Medicare, when it's Canadian, if you look at the public opinion polls, at people who really study how we feel about this is the element of greatest pride, of national pride, that we feel that we've got a public Medicare system. You want to run for a political party that says take it apart?
I wouldn't run on that platform. I would say let's have a better medical system. Let's protect the truly needy in medical terms. But mark my words, I hope we're sitting here 20 years now discussing this and looking back on it. I don't have to dismantle the medical system in Canada. It's dismantling itself. You open the paper every morning and you will see articles about waiting lines, lineups, triage, I call it. These are people who paid all their lives to get so-called universal medical care, who have to go to the States to get heart surgery. They have to wait in Canada for a year, hip replacements, hospital beds going empty, nurses that we can't pay.
No, okay.
It's a disaster.
You can quote it. You can quote some of those individual difficulties, and no one's more aware of them. We haven't got a perfect Medicare system, but let's you and I just say, where would you rather be and sick, in Arizona or Alberta?
Oh, I'd rather be in Arizona or the Stanford Medical Center in
Well,
Palo
you're
Alto.
nuts, Will Gardner. You're crazy.
Well, I would buy the medical insurance. I wouldn't go there.
What
like
if
a
you couldn't
pauper.
afford it?
Well, I would take the $6,000 I'm putting up now for my family's medical insurance and spend $5,000 for the same coverage down there. There's no question that if you have the power to take from the people any amount of their resources in the form of taxes, you can create wonderful medical systems. We have done that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying we're going to break the people. It is already 1/3 of the Ontario budget and getting worse. Something is wrong with the system. I'm not saying we haven't got a pretty good system. Hell, we had a great Olympic Games. We're still paying for that. It was the most expensive Olympic Games ever
If I've
held.
got you to go as far as to say we got a pretty good system, then I feel like
I never said we didn't.
Oh,
I said I
I
said I think the system is wrongly conceived. It's based upon all sorts of assumptions which I feel are morally wrong, economically wrong. They're probably politically right for those who put them in because it got them elected, and we'll keep getting them elected as long as the people are fooled. I'm not against the state being involved in medicine. Let it be involved, but let it compete against the private provision of those services and see how well it does. Instead, it outlaws them. Let it compete. I have no problem with that. I have no problem with the state getting involved in car insurance, but let the rest of the private sector compete with them.
Tell me about Switzerland and the Switzerlandization of Canada.
Look, Switzerland, okay. One bureaucrat for every 50
I
citizens,
got that
not one
figure.
for every 10.
I got that figure.
Lowest interest
You
rates.
looked at it on a map?
Lowest
You looked at
unemployment.
it on a map?
People
You
say,
can put it in Waterloo County or something.
well, people say that you can't do a sort of a pari passu with that, or mutatis mutandis and so on. And I say, well, I simply didn't want to choose some kind of utopian ideal, which is what the social welfare types are always choosing to compare us against. I wanted to choose a real world example, a country which had differing cultures, differing religions, and many official language groups, and very low on the way, worse than us in the way of resources. I mean, 25% of that country is covered with mountains. They don't grow chocolate trees over there. They make that stuff. And so on. It's entrepreneurial spirit. It's a peaceful country. They have the lowest interest rates, the lowest unemployment, the highest standard of living, the best welfare services, and the best education in the world, and have had for the last 50 years. And I say maybe we should compare what we're doing to a country like that and ask ourselves if there aren't some features we can pick out and apply to Canada. Let me give you just a couple. Why do we need 38 or 39 ministries when you take the ministries and their sub-ministries all together? 38 or 39 ministries for a country...
What are you talking about in the federal government?
For a country which in fact has less population and less GNP than the state of California. I say we're pumped up and it's puffery, and we're walking around the world forgiving billions of dollars here and lavishing billions of dollars there on the world. I say let's pull in and
Now, you managed to get
clean our own
you
doorstep.
managed to get your shot against foreign aid in the middle of all that, right in the middle. I asked you about Switzerland, and all of a sudden you're taking your shot at.
Well,
foreign aid.
here's why.
This is where I have trouble with your case
Here's
all
what
the
I mean
time.
by the puffery. So you can't even name the president or the prime minister of Switzerland, can you?
No,
You know why?
because I haven't done my homework.
No, not at all. It's because they don't have one. That's what I meant by puffery. They have a chairman who runs their cabinet committee of 7
Can't name
ministers.
her or him either.
No, and you know why? Because they don't consider themselves to be important. And what they say is the job of government, of this cabinet, is to manage the government, not to engineer the behavior of the Swiss citizen.
Here's my question to try to sum things up. If you're going to take all the power of the central government, the power and the money and the resources, and put them on the local or regional or provincial basis, if you're going to dismantle the bilingual structure, if you're going to weaken these federal institutions, and if, as I say, some of these other ideas that I at least would suggest are fundamentally Canadian, what's left of this country after it gets Gardnerized?
Well, I'll tell you what's left of it. First of all, those who ran the By and By Commission could have dealt with bilingualism differently. They could have used a territorial principle instead of the one they used. Canada has never been a bilingual country. The greatest percentage
no one
is
ever suggested that it should be.
15%.
But it's answering me, what's left?
Well, what's left is this. What's left is the morality of the people intact, their free will, and their willingness to hold themselves together as a federation of sovereignties, which is how the BNA Act set Canada up. People even argue in the States that Canadian provinces are relatively free compared to the States today, because their democracy, their federal democracy, was subverted through the 14th Amendment, which gave Congress, authority over all states' laws. Just like the spending power subverted ours here in Canada. This is not a unique problem to Canada. It's a Western democracy problem. And it's starting to unravel, and you'll see it unravel in Canada. Because if it doesn't unravel ideologically, like up front, like articulately, it unravels economically and starts to fall apart because it can't afford itself, which is what's happening to Canada. We have a per capita debt twice as bad as the USA.
But
We're never going to pay it off.
I'm still back at the question that I mean, if you take away all the things that you want to take away, what is there that holds this fragile country together? These are the most critical times we've ever passed.
That's right. There's a will to stay together and to allow people in each of these provinces or regions, call them what you want, to express their own individuality in an unhampered way, and to recognize that what is common to them may remain common for as long as they wish to remain common. But you can't force commonality on people. It's what we tried to do. I think we need to refederalize this country in the way it was set up in the first place under the BNA Act, and back off. This terrible imposition of central government on the lives of Canadians, that don't want it.
Thank you for this. William Gardner is the author of The Trouble with Canada, A Citizen Speaks Out. That's published by Stoddart Press. And Mr. Gardner joined me in our Toronto studio.